Wild Fermentation, the Flavor, Nutrition, and Craft of Live Culture Foods, updated and revised edition by Sandor Elix Katz, Chapter 9, Bean Ferments. Like grains, beans preserve best in their mature, dried state, maintained in a cool, dry, and dark environment. The objective of bean fermentation is less to preserve them than to make them more digestible, unlock their nutrient potential, and give them compelling flavors as well as pleasing textures. Soybeans, renowned for their protein richness, are mostly indigestible by our human digestive tracts when simply cooked and not fermented. So not only do we not access their protein, but they also contain toxic compounds associated with a host of problems. Fermentation, however, predigests the beans, breaking down proteins into amino acids that we can more easily absorb, while simultaneously breaking down toxic and nutrient-blocking compounds. Fermentation is the most effective way to realize the powerful nutritive potential of especially soybeans, but really any legumes. In addition, when beans are fermented together with grains, as they frequently are, the ferment is a complete protein containing all the amino acids essential to human nutrition. Documentation of bean fermentation goes back thousands of years. Ancient Chinese texts refer to jiangs, condiments fermented from beans as well as fish, meat, grains, and vegetables. Jiangs were and are made in elaborate variety and imbued with meaning. The Analects of Confucius direct that foods not accompanied by the appropriate variety of jiang should not be served. Rather than using only one to season all foods, you should provide many to ensure harmony with each of the basic food types. Most bean ferments just start as most grain ferments do, by simply adding water to bring the seed back to life, swelling and awakening dormant microbial and enzymatic activity. Dosas and idlis. Dosas and idlis are South Indian ferments. Dosas are thin pancakes and idlis are steam breads, both made from batters born of the same rice and lentil fermentation of just a day or two. They share a wonderful flavor with very different textures. I saw idlis compared with matzo balls in one cookbook, but I think they have a distinctive spongy texture all on their own. Dosas and idlis are the easiest, fastest, and most straightforward of the bean ferments included in this book. And there is a recipe. Coconut chutney. Chutneys are condiments in Indian food, made in infinite variety. This coconut chutney from southern India is an excellent accompaniment of idlis or dosas. It is sweet and sour simultaneously and can be eaten fresh or fermented for just a few days. This recipe is inspired by Shanta Nimbark's Sakharov's Flavors of India, Vegetarian Indian Cooking. There's a recipe. Sambar. Sambar is a vegetable dal for which I love its rich flavors and its incredible versatility in that it can incorporate almost any vegetables that might be available. I was first introduced to sambar by my departed and much missed friend and teaching partner, Frank Cook, who traveled extensively in southern India. We would always serve idlis in our workshops along with sambar. And there's a recipe. Miso. Miso is Japanese fermented soybean paste made in a wide range of styles. Varieties of miso may be fermented in as little as a couple of weeks or for many years. Miso is rich in flavor and can be quite salty. It is most famous as a soup, but also used as a marinade, rub, pickling agent, and flavoring in dressings, sauces, spreads, and condiments. In Japan, miso is an iconic food, long associated with good health and longevity. The first homemade miso I tried was made by my late friend Dr. Crazy Owl, a quirky practitioner of Chinese medicine who extolled the healing powers of miso. The first time I tried Owl's homemade miso, I fell in love with it. So chunky and flavorful. Its aliveness inspired me to learn how to make miso, and I have made crocks of it every winter since. Of all the foods I have fermented, this is the one that has met with the greatest appreciation over time. So few people make their own miso, and the people who use miso at all are very passionate about it. Making your own miso to share with the people you love is a way to nourish them deeply. Though miso is classically made with soybeans, it can be made with any legume or combination of legumes. The distinctive color and flavor of each bean carries over into the miso it produces. Use what is abundantly available to you and be bold in your fermentation experimentation. The process of actually making miso is quite simple. The only thing hard about it is making or finding koji, a critical ingredient in miso. Koji is grain or beans with the mold Aspergillus oryzae grown on it and used as a starter for miso, as well as sake, soy sauce, amazake, and other fermentations. Making koji is beyond the scope of this book, though it can be done, and you can find extensive information on the process in the book The Art of Fermentation, and even more in Shurtleff's and Aoyagi's The Book of Miso. To buy koji or koji starter for making your own, see the sources listed in the appendix. Miso is made in many different styles, with huge regional variation. One way of conceptualizing two broad categories is sweet misos, which ferment for less time, require less salt, and use more koji, all of which makes them sweet, and salty misos, which ferment for much longer, using roughly twice as much salt and half as much koji. I would recommend trying the long fermenting salty misos only if you have a cellar or other unheated winter space. Even a garage or shed is fine. In a heated space, miso can dry into a dense brick, a stark contrast with its typical soft, spreadable, and pasty consistency. Sweet misos are incredibly delicious and can be fermented pretty much anywhere, and for only 1 to 4 weeks, making them more accessible. Sweet miso. Sweet miso is almost like a chutney, something that can stand on its own as a condiment and isn't so strong that it must be diluted, like its saltier cousin. I like the flavor and textural variation of incorporating other ingredients beyond beans and koji. One of my favorite classic styles is finger-lickin' miso, which incorporates vegetables. Another favorite is natto miso, in which beans are left whole and seaweed and a sweetener are added. This sweet miso is a hybrid incorporating elements of both of these styles. This miso is ready to taste in as little as a week, producing a rich, complex flavor that will evolve with passing time. Red miso. This miso is strong and salty. It requires most of a year of fermentation or longer. The shortest it would typically ferment would be through spring, summer, and fall. In a heated space, this would be your best bet, as fermenting miso through the winter or more in a heated space dries the miso into a dense brick. In a cellar or other unheated space, this miso gets even better if you can wait a few years. Red miso is traditionally made with soybeans, though its color can vary, especially using different beans. I like to make miso with chickpeas, pinto beans, and field peas, among others. I've experimented widely and can honestly say that every bean I've ever tried has made miso that has tasted delicious. And there's the recipe. Miso soup. The classic way to enjoy miso is in the form of miso soup. No food I know is more soothing. When you make miso soup, miso is the last thing you add. In its simplest form, miso soup is just hot water with miso and 1 tablespoon of miso per cup of or 250 milliliters of water. Add the hot water to the miso and blend it thoroughly. Avoid boiling miso. Gentler heat helps preserve its aliveness. On the other hand, miso soup can be elaborate as you want. Adding seaweed is generally where I start. Seaweeds have deep, complex flavors. Some people think it makes them sound more appealing to call them sea vegetables, but I like to honor their wildness by calling them weeds. They carry the essence of the sea. They are mineral-rich and nourish the cardiovascular system, improve digestion, help regulate metabolism and glandular and hormonal flows, and calm the nervous system. One of their specific benefits is a compound called alginic acid, which binds with heavy metals such as lead and mercury and radioactive elements like strontium-90 and carries them out of your body. I love to incorporate a little of it pretty much in anything I cook. Miso soup is almost always prepared with seaweed. Japanese recipes for dashi or soup stock traditionally call for kombu, a Pacific Ocean seaweed. I have frequently bought seaweed from small-scale harvesters in Maine where kombu is not found. The North Atlantic equivalent is called Laminaria digitata. Digitata is a thick and hardy variety of kelp. Each stalk's growth splits into several digits of wavy green-brown flesh, hence the name digitata. I had a memorable experience harvesting digitata, helping my seaweed harvester friends Matt and Raivo off the Schutic Peninsula in down east Maine. We woke up at 4 a.m., squeezed ourselves into skin-tight wetsuits, and drove down to the harbor. We got into a wooden boat that Matt had built himself, and then towed a smaller wooden boat, which he had also built. Do-it-yourself has no limits. We glided through the calm bay waters into the foggy dawn for a long time, and I wondered how many guides could possibly navigate in the dense grayness where the sea, sky, and land all blended into one. We saw seagulls and seals. The water got choppier. We were headed beyond the harbor to the turbulent ocean waters where digitata thrives. We arrived at our destination just as the tide was getting low enough to give us access. Seaweed harvesting is ruled by the tides, as the plants are most accessible when the tides are at their lowest. We anchored the big boat and got into the smaller boat, then aimed for a large stand of digitata growing from an underwater rock ledge. When we got near the digitata, we jumped out of the boat and onto the cold, choppy water. Matt and Raivo took turns staying in the boat to keep it from drifting away, continually rowing back to where we were so we could toss the digitata that we harvested into the boat. There, I was in the ocean with a sharp knife in my hand. The idea was to stand on the rock ledge from which the digitata was growing and cut the stalk to harvest it. Sounds straightforward enough, and it would have been had the waters been kind enough to stop. But every time a wave came rolling rhythmically in. Suddenly, the water over the rock ledge I was standing on was about 5 feet deep instead of 2 feet. Reaching down to the digitata stalk in the deeper water involved dunking my entire body, head included, into the ocean. And half the time, the wave would knock me right off the ledge. I spent a lot that morning flailing around, knife in one hand, seaweed in the other, feeling like Lucy Ricardo in another madcap misadventure. When I'd actually get a handful of digitata, the goal was to throw it into the rowboat, another challenge intensified by the rough water. It was crazy and incredibly fun, regardless of how little I managed to harvest. And as my body was pushed around by the waves, I identified with the seaweeds, whose lives are a continual push and pull of the tidal influences. Several small rowboat loads later, the tide was rising too high for us to continue, so we boated back in the mid-morning sun to the south of Goldsboro Harbor, nestled in a bed of slippery digitata. Most of the seaweed available in the United States is imported from Japan, where it is a popular food and is farmed intensively with unknown radiation impact from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. I want to make a plug for seaweed bioregionalism. Edible seaweeds are abundant in many cooler coastal areas. In general, they are rarely harvested. If you live in such an area, try to find clean and accessible spots to harvest. Take only what you need and limit your impact. Or try to find and support small seaweed harvesters nearby in coastal regions. We were making miso soup, and here's how I do it. And that's the recipe. You'll have to check it out. Miso tahini spread. Another great way to enjoy miso is as a spread, sauce, or dressing. Miso pickles and tamari. Miso is an excellent medium for pickling vegetables. My favorite to pickle in this way are radishes, turnips, and other root vegetables. If they are small, up to 2 inches or 5 centimeters, you can leave them whole. Otherwise, coarsely chop. Experiment with other vegetables as well. And there's the recipe. Tempeh. Tempeh is a soybean ferment from Indonesia that has become known as a meat substitute in Western vegetarian cuisines. It is really worth the trouble of making tempeh yourself. The frozen version sold in stores is what I call a vehicle food, only as good as the flavors you smother it with. Freshly fermented tempeh, on the other hand, has a rich, unique, delicious flavor and texture. Tempeh was popularized in the North American vegetarian subcultures via the farm, the most famous of the 1970s hippies communes, which at one time had more than 1,000 residents relying on a soy-based diet, which they quickly recognized required fermentation. Folks at the farm learned to propagate spores of the mold Rhizopus oligosporus and distributed them widely along with detailed directions for simple home propagation. The ones I learned from, available in the New Farm Vegetarian Cookbook, a classic vegetarian text still in print. See the appendix for resources on tempeh starter. Beyond obtaining the spores, the trickiest part of making tempeh can be maintaining a warm environment. I initially learned the farm method, which mimicked typical Indonesian temperatures around 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 to 32 degrees Celsius for 24 hours. The easiest method was waiting for hot summer weather. For years, I used the oven of a propane stove with just the pilot light on, with a mason jar ring propping the door open just enough so that it doesn't get too hot. You can also use the heat generated by illuminating lights on the many ovens, or with an oven with a proofing setting. I built a simple incubator that has worked great using a non-functioning refrigerator heated by an incandescent light bulb regulated by a thermostatic device made for regulating temperatures in a greenhouse. Then a few years ago, I met an Indonesian couple with a tempeh business in California who incubate at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius for 48 hours, using a thermostatic heating unit in a small room. Lately in winter, I've been incubating tempeh on a high shelf near the wood stove. Innovate. Make it work. Be sure to maintain good air circulation around the incubating tempeh. It needs oxygen but cannot dry out, so it must be wrapped in a way that holds moisture and allows air flow for circulation. Traditionally, tempeh has been wrapped in banana leaves. The typical temperate adaptation is to use plastic bags with tiny holes poked at regular intervals. Soy tempeh. Oh, there's the recipe, but we're not reading the recipe. Next picture. Black-eyed pea and oat tempeh. The tempeh recipe above is the most basic variety, that's the soy one, but you can incorporate any kind of legumes as well as grains into your tempeh. Here's an example of black-eyed pea and oat tempeh. So there's a recipe. Sweet and spicy glazed tempeh with broccoli and daikon. My friend Orchid, a fellow communard from the early days, has been a major source of culinary inspiration for me. This is a delicious and gorgeous dish that he created with the tempeh I made. That sounds fabulous. I'm just going to look at that recipe for a second. It takes less than an hour. It's got tempeh, broccoli, daikon radish, orange juice, honey, arrowroot powder, sesame oil, rice, vinegar, wine, chili paste, tamari, miso. Miso! Gotta make miso and tempeh. Vegetable oil, minced ginger root, minced garlic, ground white pepper. Dang! That sounds good. You gotta have a lot of ingredients not a lot of people have. Okay, tempeh Reuben sandwiches. A great way to enjoy tempeh is in a tempeh Reuben sandwich. This sandwich incorporates 4 different ferments: bread, tempeh, sauerkraut, and cheese. Wow. Wonder if it's farmer cheese. Let's see, what kind of cheese is it? Oh, Swiss cheese, or your favorite. Okay, well, that is the end